Hello, this is Adam House, and this is my undergraduate course diary as I am taking a class in global history topics entitled Resisting Fascism in Global History for the fall semester of 2025. This is weeks 14 and 15 combined into one video, and this will be the final video in my series. With a little caveat there, I may do one more video based on my final research paper that I've turned in already. So we'll see what happens. But if I add that one, we'll probably call it a bonus video. So for all intents and purposes, this is the final video in our series of Resisting Fascism in Global History. And again, this is combining weeks 14 and 15 classroom lectures and materials that were used outside of class. Although I'm not always including all of the materials, there's no way I could include all of the materials that we use for class in any given video. They tend to go longer than I intended these videos to go anyway. So, all right. So let's dig into the final week of class here. And again, this is not me playing professor. I am not trying to reteach what I've learned in class. This is more about me reflecting on class materials and homework and the readings, the different things that we've covered throughout the semester. And so I am not engaged in copyright infraction or trying to play professor on the internet or anything like that. Again, this is a student. This is as an undergraduate student reflecting on the material that I'm covering in class. And although this video probably is more for other people's benefit than it is myself this time, as I have already finished all of the class materials. Now I'm just waiting for the grade to come back. So patiently waiting on pins and needles for the professors to release final grades for the semester. So I don't necessarily need the reflection this time. But I realize that I've released videos about class and materials throughout the semester for public consumption, and I hate to leave you hanging on the last one without resolution. So this video is about the last book. I'm going to talk about the last book that we read for the class and a little bit of the discussion that we've had in class, and then give you some final thoughts, some parting thoughts about all of the material we've covered this semester. So if you're interested in resisting fascism and global history, first of all, I highly recommend that you take a college course in this. I have to say, as a senior now in college, obviously as a non-traditional student, an old guy going back to school on my military education benefits, that this may very well have been the most worthwhile college class I've ever taken. And, they all are important in their own way, pros and cons for each one as well. Yeah, obviously you need the general ed, you need your science, you need your math, and even when you're a sociology, political science and history student like I am, all those things are still important as well. And but so, all right, anyway, let's dig into the material, which I think is very much worth covering. So the final book that we read for class, all of the other books that we've read throughout the semester have been nonfiction. They've been history books. They've mostly diaries. We've covered a lot of journals that were kept by people who were involved in resistance during World War II against the Axis powers, specifically Nazi Germany, but also other authors from other places and other time periods as well. So All those materials have been great. I think I've enjoyed all the reads that we've had. If you're interested in those materials, you can go back through the videos. And, most weeks I had at least one book or one journal article or something to share. Sometimes a film. So, what I'm going to do with classroom materials here is basically, like I said, I've mentioned them in previous videos, so you can go back like that and check out some of the previous materials. But I'm also including this final diary video in a playlist on my YouTube channel. Again, this is not monetized. This is not me trying to make a career as a YouTuber. I'm actually not interested in that. I don't really have the video editing skills or other skill sets that I would really need to be proficient with that. So as you can probably tell, the production quality is not professional by any stretch of the imagination. So if you get something out of it, great. If not, that's okay too. But so what I've done is I've created a playlist, Resisting Fascism and Global History, on my YouTube channel. And what you can do then is set one of the videos from the playlist and go through as you want. Watch whichever videos you want. Now, what I've done, at least for the time being, is that I have also included some of the classroom materials in the video list. So there's going to be about a dozen videos that are me in this format talking about class materials that I've been through that week or for a couple of weeks here and there. But I'm also including videos in that play, so you'll see that there's a significant number of videos in that playlist, quite a few more than about the dozen that I've spoken in. And what those videos are they're videos that we have watched for class, and they are previews of, say, let's start with the ones that we've watched for class. There's Nazi Town, USA. There's and that's a good history of fascism throughout history in the United States. And let's see what else. There's Women in Resistance, a really good one about some European women that resisted during World War II. And there's another one I think it's called The Good Fight, talking about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade of Americans who volunteered and went to Spain to fight on the Republican side against the fascists during World War II, or before World War II, during the Spanish Civil War. And then there's other videos in there you'll see as well. Some of these videos were not required to be watched for class, but they were mentioned in class, or the professor, or maybe even just other students that knew about them, referred to them in class. And so I've included some of those videos. I tend to cover this material in this class throughout the semester pretty thoroughly. So even materials that I was not required to cover for class, I still engaged those materials just because, I wanted to do the extra work. I wanted to get as much out of this class as I possibly could. So you'll see some videos in there that I didn't have to watch, but I still watched, and they were referred to in class, so technically they still relate to the material. They're still a part of class, if you want to say. And then there's a few videos in there in the playlist on my YouTube channel, Resisting Fascism and Global History, that are just movie previews. So, if the entirety of the movie was not available on YouTube, then basically what I did was I found a preview for the movie that was listed on YouTube, and I just put the preview in my playlist. So it'll be only like 1 to 3 minutes at the most, a preview of a movie, and then so that at least gives you an idea of some of the films that we watched as well, or that were referred to, and then you can watch the preview, decide for yourself whether you want to seek out the movie yourself, and then that way just go to whatever streaming platforms you use and see if you can find the movie on your own if you're interested. Some of these movies were pretty good. Now, I've seen some of these movies before. And there's several good ones in there. There's also a few movies in there that I was not familiar with, and they're definitely worth seeking out as well. There's some old movies, even black and white movies, that are referred to in there that I had either maybe seen when I was a kid. It's been 30, 40 years ago since I've seen them. Um, that I went back and watched as a result of taking this class, and of course, you get a lot different. You get something different out of a movie when you're almost 50 as opposed to when you're like 10 years old. So anyway, those are worth checking out. And so I highly recommend that you flip through my playlist on the YouTube channel and find the materials that appeal to you. And if you want to watch all of it, go for it. Again, this was one of the most worthwhile and fulfilling classes I think I've ever taken at the college level. And I think engaging these materials is timely and interesting. So we have one more book to talk about. And this is from, some of you are going to recognize this one for sure. Arthur Miller, playwright Arthur Miller, was born in 1915, lived until 2005. So about 90 years of Arthur Miller. Over those years, he wrote many different books, and mostly for the stage. So he's really a playwright, more so. And what most of you are probably going to remember more than something like this is his play, The Crucible. So that's the one that I would most expect you to be familiar with and to know Arthur Miller from, is the play The Crucible. Crucible, I believe, was published, it was the 1950s. I want to say around 53, 54, something like that. I looked it up before, but I forget the exact year. But it's like early to mid 50s when he published The Crucible. This one, this play was published in 1964, and then came to the United States, was published as a book in the United States for the first time in 1965. Arthur Miller tended to cover themes that are appropriate to our topic here. Yeah, so this book it's short, so again, you can look at pages here, are pretty easy to get through. It's not real dense, not real difficult read. And this edition, this version, is only about 70 pages of that. So I think I read this in a less than a couple hours, or maybe an hour or two or something. I was able to, it was a quick read, but a very good read. So you could definitely read the entirety of Arthur Miller's book entitled Incident at Vichy. You could definitely read it in one sitting. So, Incident at Vichy, of course, Vichy refers to the capital of France during World War II that was loyal to the Axis powers. So, of course, during World War II, France is kind of divided. There's a significant resistance going on as well. And so the government of France that the Allies wanted to recognize was outcast at the time, and so they were, Charles de Gaulle, President Charles de Gaulle was trying to basically run the resistance from outside of the country. And then Vichy was considered the capital that the Axis powers controlled and wanted to recognize. So, Incident at Vichy by Arthur Miller, again, another great read, worth your time. And it has been made into plays many times, and some versions of that have been recorded, and I have found them available on the internet as well. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think I included one of the stage performances that had been recorded on video in my Resisting Fascism and Global History playlist on YouTube. So if you want to read it that way or watch it that way, or even read along and watch it at the same time, that's available to you. Basically, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but basically, I would sum this book up in this is an exercise in looking at humanity, in visiting the issue, the topic, the what's the word I want to use? Complicated, the complicated topic of humanity, and. So just so you understand, this book is fiction. It's a fictional writing, but it's something based on true events. It's something that very much could have happened, and in versions in real life kind of did happen. So yeah, it's a fictionalized version of real events, if you want to put it that way. And but it forces us to kind of take a look in the mirror and kind of evaluate our humanity in the context of resisting fascism and what was happening during the time period of this book's setting, which is again during World War II and in France. So I want to read part of one paragraph, short few lines here, that I believe are the heart of the book, that is basically the section of the book that stands out to me the most and most represents what the book is really trying to focus on. And so these are, just to quickly give you an understanding of what's happening here, there's a cast of characters in France who have been rounded up by Nazis and taken to a holding facility where they are interviewed and interrogated one by one to see if they have the proper paperwork that proves that they're not Jews or they're not somehow enemies of the Third Reich, or any other group that the Third Reich really had in its sights at the time. And so, as these men are sitting in the waiting room in this holding facility, they're having discussions with one another about their lives and what this means, and what are they going to do when it's my turn, and so they have some very interesting conversations while they're sitting in this waiting room waiting to be interrogated by the Nazis, to see if they're quote unquote loyal enough to the Third Reich, as French people or people in France at the time, and to make sure that they're not Jews or some other group that the Nazis were targeting. And so there's some dialogue going on here. And so during some of this dialogue, while they're waiting, one of the characters says, "Part of knowing who we are is knowing we are not someone else." And Jew is only the name we give to that stranger, that agony we cannot feel, that death we look at like a cold abstraction. Each man has his Jew, it is the other, and the Jews have their Jews. And now, above all, you must see that you have yours, the man whose death leaves you relieved that you are not him, despite your decency. And that is why there is nothing and will be nothing until you face your own complicity with this, your own humanity. That's from page 66 in this version of Arthur Miller's Incident at Vichy. Again, worthwhile read. All right, so last thing I want to do, parting thoughts. And this is going to come from the project that I did for my final paper for class. So kind of the culmination of the semester's research and materials. So basically I asked 3 questions, and the 3 questions, and these questions are geared around, our thesis had to be something to do with reasons for resistance or lack of resistance, but most specifically, what takes a minority resistance and turns it into a majority resistance in the context of resisting fascism. And so there was a lot of other questions around that, and different ways that we could kind of take the different directions. We could kind of take the question and do our evaluations. And we were restricted to using course materials only. And so following the parameters of what the professor wanted, what I came up with was to basically ask 3 major questions and try to answer those, and then have a little discussion and come to some kind of conclusion there. All right, so my first question is, when fascism is on the rise, or when it's already bearing down, why do people choose not to resist? All right, so I think it's important to understand the reasons people don't resist can help us answer the larger question. All right, so one of the answers that we have is disbelief, or naivety, if you want to put it that way, or just denial. The idea being that sometimes people just can't believe that fascism is on the rise. Even it's one of those things. It's like, despite the nose on their face, they just can't believe it. They can't believe that Hitler will be taken seriously. He's a raving lunatic, and so that was part of what made the rise of Hitler in Germany possible, was that people just didn't believe that such a raving lunatic and his band of misfits could ever actually seize power, and even if and when they did come into power, people still didn't believe that the Nazis would actually follow through on a lot of the things that they said that they wanted to do, specifically around the idea of purging the earth of Jews. So there was a journalist, an American journalist in Nazi Germany by the name of Dorothy Thompson, and in about 1934, right after the Nazis come into power, she starts to warn the rest of the world that, hey, the Nazis are doing exactly the things that they said that they wanted to do while they were on the rise. And the Jews here in Germany are suffering because of this. And this is going a really bad direction, and I think where we're going is about to be pretty nasty. And of course, the Nazis expelled her from the country. She was deported, came back to the United States, and of course, history reveals that that she was right. The Nazis were engaged in exactly what the crazy things that they said that they were going to do on their way into power, they actually ended up following through on. So the world was kind of in denial, kind of naive about the threat, and didn't take the Nazi threat seriously. And this tends to be a theme throughout history, is that when fascism is on the rise, people tend to write it off as crackpot rhetoric and crackpot propaganda, and um, angry, unhinged people that don't know what they're talking about, that can't be taken seriously, that will never actually follow through on the crazy things that comes out of their mouth. And so fascism tends to be underestimated, and that is one of its advantages. It's one of the dynamics that fascism uses to its advantage, is that it's just typically not taken seriously enough when it's on the rise. Um, so another reason that people do not resist is sometimes the belief that people are seeing something new and different, and that it is something that might be able to solve the current problems. So, again, when we go back to the time of the Great Depression, and when the entire world, it wasn't just the United States, it was the entire world that was feeling the effects of the Depression. And uh, during that time, there was a real question as to, well, as the world has become, many of the countries, many of the governments of the world have become more open, more democratic. It doesn't seem to be able to stop us from having poverty. It doesn't seem, as good as some of the things are that democracy has given us. It seems to have failed in some ways, and so uh, it kind of lends itself to people looking for other things, becoming disheartened, disenfranchised with democracy, and looking to other ideologies and other systems of government, and other systems for how human beings might organize ourselves. And so this lends itself to looking at things like communism, fascism, and other things. And so that was also one of the things that has kept people from resisting, is they're in dire circumstances. Democracy doesn't seem to be giving adequate answers to the problems that they're facing. And so out of desperation, they reach for something they don't really understand, or they don't know that can be and or will be so dangerous. So, all right, another reason people do not resist is that there are fascist intellectuals, scientists, and others who tend to give an air of legitimacy to fascism. So, even among academics, even among people who are trusted in society, and powerful people in our greatest institutions, they sometimes can still have fascist sympathies. And, you get a few of these people that start to speak up and take the side of fascism. Again, in the United States, you look at, Charles Lindbergh was one of the most famous people, one of the most respected people in the entire world, when he became a pivotal person within the America First movement in the 1930s. And of course, Henry Ford, the auto tycoon of Ford Motor Company. So in the United States, you had people who were respected, who were successful, who were considered some of the greatest minds and greatest achievers of the day, who took the side of fascism, and this can be influential. And a lot of people will be influenced by that. So another reason people don't resist is they are influenced by people that they respect, people of power, people with money, and people that they think know what they're talking about. All right, so another reason people do not resist is the ability of fascism. Fascism has demonstrated an ability to co-opt religion, to use religion in its favor. Catholicism specifically, but all of Christianity, has a long history of anti-Semitism going back all the way to the early centuries, the early centuries after Christ. So even back to the Roman Empire, the high days of the Roman Empire. And, so in Germany you had the Reichschurch and then you had the professing church. So basically Nazi Germany took over the Reichschurch, or took over much of Christianity. And, Catholicism has a black eye to this day for its embrace of the Nazi Empire back when it was coming into power. And of course, here in the United States, the fascist movement that we have looked at before of the Ku Klux Klan, they consider themselves a Christian organization. That's really what they're kind of rallying around. The banner under which they operate is Christianity. They consider white Christianity to be the true religion. And so, the greatest, most prolific terrorist organization in American history is a white Christian supremacist organization. Unfortunately. All right, so, and then Francisco Franco in Spain very much did the same thing. He was able to co-opt Catholicism to bring support to his fascist movement, and the beat goes on, as it were. So, another reason people don't resist is that it does tend to use collective punishment, and not just collective punishment, but brutality in general. Fascism uses bullying techniques, and so people are scared. Fascism uses fear. Fascism uses demagoguery. Fascism uses hate. And it uses these things effectively. It uses division. It uses racial insecurities. It uses religious insecurities. It plays on those insecurities and makes people fearful and divides people. And so fascism often comes to power by using punishment and fear and suffering as a tool to make fearful people comply. That's just what it boils down to. It's forced compliance through coercion, and that's typically what fascism will do in all of its iterations. All right, so also another reason people don't resist fascism is within the historical examination, we can see that a lot of times populations of people in any given country are already maybe kind of polarized, or there's some real stresses going on within their political, within their politics, within the body politic. And so, you tend to get like there's some real polarization going on, and so you get communists and fascists who are kind of gaining traction at the same time. And so conservatives especially tend to be more concerned about the rise of socialism, communism, and other leftist ideologies than they are about fascism. So they tend not to take, so again, if we want to look at the historical record, Nazi Germany being, one of the prime examples, the conservatives in Germany, they misjudged the threat that Hitler and the fascists represented, and they knew that the population of Germans, especially their conservative movements, were more concerned about the rise of the rise of communism, and therefore they played on those fears. They used the tactics of Red Scare to scare the population into reaching for a more radical right-wing ideology as sort of a fortification or a bulwark against communism and socialism and leftist ideologies, leftist culture, leftist politics, leftist economics, whatever you want to, however you kind of want to quantify that. And so, the snake that the conservatives like to play with sometimes tends to come back and bite them in the long run because they underestimated the danger of the snake that they were handling. And when they decided to, when Hindenburg decided to appoint Hitler as chancellor, he didn't realize that what he was doing was sealing his own fate, putting the nail in the coffin of the Weimar Republic, and that Hitler would rise to absolute power, and of course, the rest is history, as they say. So, sometimes even our highest ideals, those of us who take a free, are consider free speech and liberalism, pluralism, openness, liberty. Those of us who consider those kinds of ideals as our highest ideals sometimes can lead us not to oppose fascism adequately. So, we've talked about this in earlier videos. Immediately following World War II, in Britain, you have fascists marching in the street. In less than a year's time, at the end of World War II, within less than a year's time, you have fascists back in the streets marching under the swastika and spewing their anti-Semitic and xenophobic rhetoric, racist rhetoric, all through the streets, and the British government at the time was concerned about going too far in trying to oppose these fascists. So we don't want to violate our highest ideals of things like free speech and free debate. And they looked to Nazi Germany, and they realized, after the fall of the Third Reich, Germany is trying to reconstruct itself, and they are engaged in a program of denazification. And the campaign of Nazification included things like outlawing throwing the Roman salute, outlawing display of the swastika, and things like this. And Britain looked at that and said, yeah, it makes us a little uncomfortable. We don't really want to go that far. And so the people of Britain decided, or the government of Britain decided not to use the hammer, the power of government, to really come down on the fascists who were in the street at the time. Now, hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that in a minute. But again, the idea here in this question about why do people not resist fascism is that sometimes our highest ideals can kind of work against us like that. All right. And then it should never be underestimated the privilege of a beneficiary to what fascism has to offer. If you're in 1930s Germany and you're a white person with blue eyes, blonde hair, lily white skin, and your facial features and everything are like, a photograph of you could be used as the poster child of Aryanism, of whiteness, then, you might be a little more willing to throw the Jews and the other minorities under the bus, because, in the hierarchy that fascism is presenting, you will be the beneficiary of that. And so we should never underestimate the appeal of what fascism has to offer to its beneficiaries. Same thing here in the United States. If you're a poor white farmer in the Deep South, it's pretty easy to scapegoat black and brown immigrants, as being the problem. It's like this persecution complex, this victimology, this victim complex of, you get to, as a poor white person in America, You can play the victim by blaming black and brown people for all your problems. And, unfortunately, we've had a long history of a lot of that. So, again, the idea is basically people will reach to authoritarian powers out of desperation because, they're looking for somebody else to blame, and they're looking for a different type of system that will make them the beneficiaries, even if that means subjugating someone else, or bringing pain, suffering, heartache on other people. Sometimes human nature is such that people will be willing to do that. All right, so now let's go to question number 2. Why do people choose to resist? And there's several answers to this one as well. The most profound answer that I have come up with, I'm going to go straight to that. The best answer that I have come up with is that people tend to resist fascism when they recognize their connection with their fellow humanity. When people find their propensity for empathy, when they find their propensity for sympathy, that is the human connection that can compel us to stand against any force that would threaten our humanity and our fellow humanity. Empathy and sympathy. And this is demonstrated time and again through all of the examples that I just listed as for why people don't resist fascism. There's another side of that coin where other people are compelled, they're inspired. Some people describe it as they couldn't do anything else. They recognize the danger, they recognize the threat, they recognize the potential of the pain and suffering that can be exacted because of the consequences of fascism against people, against humanity. And so fascism, we can see it as a scourge on humanity that always must be resisted, something that we must always be vigilant against. There's coming back to the idea of free speech and academic freedom. Some people feel such a fidelity. They feel that free speech and things like academic freedom and freedom of the press, freedom of religion are so sacrosanct that they're willing to give their very lives to preserve that freedom, to preserve those liberties for people. And so to me, that's indicative of the best among us. Those who are willing to literally lay down their lives to preserve that kind of liberty and those kinds of freedoms for themselves and their families and friends and their fellow humanity. And so basically what drives people to resist fascism, connection to humanity. The more you're disconnected from your humanity, the easier it is to embrace the monstrosity of fascism. The more you are connected to your humanity, the more you are likely to oppose fascism, in my opinion, based on my studies and research. Don't underestimate that there are those who have resisted fascism in history out of anger, even out of vengeance. There's a famous Jewish resistance fighter during World War II by the name of Abba Kovner, and he pretty much flat out said this, that he and others had gotten to a point where they were no longer trying to save their own lives. They were no longer trying to save the lives of others. They basically, they had seen so much, they had experienced so much, they knew so much, and they had been through so much for so long that the only thing left to them was that they just wanted to fight the fucking Nazis. And sometimes you just get to that point. Sometimes you just get to that point. You just want to fight the bad guy. You just want to fight the evil. And there's a long conversation there to be had about the dynamics of that, the complications of that, and how there are both pros and cons with that. But the point being, when we ask the question, what inspires some people to resist, sometimes it's just, some people, you've just had enough. You've just had enough and you're just ready to fight. So, okay. And there are others, I saw this in the military when I was in the Army. One time during basic training, one of my drill sergeants had us all. It was more of like more of a laid back environment at that moment. At that point in the day, we were basically just sitting in a circle or sitting in rows or something, waiting for time to go to the DFAC to go get chow. And the drill sergeant was just curious, and so he had us stand up in our platoon. He had us stand up one by one and give our reasons for why we joined the Army. And, there was probably 30 something people in my platoon. And so each one of us stood up and kind of just gave our little spiel for why we each individually joined the Army. And as you can imagine, the reasons are almost as various or numerous as there were people. And yeah, you get the obligatory patriotism, and and this is a wartime army too. We're talking like we're already at war in Afghanistan, we're already at war in Iraq, and so these people are joining a wartime army voluntarily. And people stood up, and there's patriotism, there's a sense of duty, a sense of honor. Some people just wanted college benefits. They just wanted to be able to afford to go to college, and they shared that. Some people just said, "Hey, I was bored. I didn't know what to do. I just graduated high school, and I have no clue what to do with my life, and figured the Army could help me find a path forward." So you get people that want a sense of adventure. And so this is the one that I kind of wanted to hone in on because, when we read for this class this semester, when we read Laurie Lee's book, A Moment of War, talking about how he volunteered and crossed the Pyrenees Mountains from France into Spain on foot just to get to a war. And never in the book, he never really tells us his motivations for going. Other than, it just seemed like he was kind of looking for something to do out of a sense of adventure. And so the reasons for resisting fascism can be just as numerous as the people who choose to resist. So keep that in mind when you think about what motivates somebody to resistance. All right, so to the final question, going kind of long here. I need to finish this quickly. The final question then, the culminating question is, what accounts, because in the historical examination we have identified that resistance to fascism is rare. That's just a fact. Unfortunately, resistance to fascism tends to be too little too late. And although fascism is often ultimately defeated, just as, Hitler took his own life in his bunker, and Goring and others had to sit for the Nuremberg trials, and people like Adolf Eichmann are hunted down later. Just like, Francisco Franco's regime didn't last forever. Just like Imperial Japan was defeated by atomic weapons, by the United States dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that ended Imperial Japan. And the other examples that we have through history of how fascism is ultimately defeated, unfortunately, we often have to get to that point where, fascism has gone way too far by the time we reach a critical mass of resistance to adequately meet the moment and stop fascism. Unfortunately, the historical record is that fascism it gets out of hand before we tend to be able to marshal all of our resources against it enough to stop it. So again, I want to drive this home. Resistance to fascism is too rare. It's too rare. So the final question is, what accounts for populations embracing widespread or popular resistance? In other words, what is it that accounts for when resistance goes from a minority activity to a majority activity? How do we reach that critical mass? What accounts for those movements that eventually reach critical mass and are able to then stop fascism? One of the things that happens is there are, let's see, unfortunately, one of the reasons is maybe not that honorable in the examination, and that is like when we look at resistance in Germany, the Nazi regime in Germany. There wasn't very much resistance. By the time Hitler came into power and he was able to pass the Enabling Act, that was kind of the end of resistance. The communists and others that wanted to resist Hitler kind of had their final push, and then that was it. You didn't see a lot of resistance after that. Now, with a few little exceptions here and there from the German people, notably the White Rose resistance that we have covered in previous videos in this series. But even in the White Rose resistance leaflets, the leaflets that they dispensed at the dispersed at the University of Munich, that they were captured and guillotined and, murdered, killed for by the Nazis, even in those leaflets, part of their argument to their fellow Germans of why it was time to rise up was, hey, this is 1943. You've already had the Germans defeat on much of the field, and it very much looks like Germany is going to lose this war. Most level-headed people, now there were plenty of people well propagandized and indoctrinated that still, for some reason, believe that Germany could win the war. But for all intents and purposes, most level-headed, practical people understood that their days were numbered and that the Germans, the Axis powers, were going to lose World War II. And so even in the White Rose resistance leaflets, where they were making the case to their fellow Germans for why it was time for them to resist, they even said something to the effect that, what's going to happen to our honor when all the atrocities that have been committed here in Germany really come to light around the world? What are people going to think of us? What about the dishonor that we're going to have to live with for who knows how long, generations into the future, of Germans that are going to have to live with the dishonor of what happened in Nazi Germany? And so I don't want to take anything away from the White Rose resistance or any other Germans who did resist, but it just, it's just a point. It just goes to show that, it's not maybe the most honorable of reasons that somebody would be compelled to resistance, but just to understand that embarrassment and shame sometimes are and can be a motivating factor. So that can sometimes compel people to resistance. Unfortunately, it was not enough in Germany. And the greater picture here then is that because it wasn't enough, it did take the Axis doing the things that it did before the rest of the world kind of came to the rescue. And so that brings us to the point when we're asking about what turns a minority resistance into a majority resistance. It brings us to the point that in World War II, much of the world did not join the Allied effort against the Axis until it was already apparent that the Allies were going to win. So, unfortunately, you had to have millions of Russian and other lives lost at Stalingrad in the victory of Stalingrad. And you had to, on the Eastern Front, and then more like the Western Front, you had to have the D-Day invasion of the Allies, on the beaches, and start to make their way across Europe before you really get to the point where the most of the rest of the world are really going to go all in with the Allies. And then it's as much about jockeying for position, after the war. At that point, it's, the war is there's still a lot to be fought. You're still going to have a year or two of fighting, but it's kind of a foregone conclusion by this point. Everybody knows the Allies are going to win, and so people start to think about what's going to happen after the war, and what do I want my position to be in that, and do I want to be seen as one of the people who resisted or not. And so, again, it's kind of a comment on human nature that, unfortunately, a lot of people are not willing to step out there and take the risk and go kind of put all their chips on the table, as it were, and go all in until they see the writing is already on the wall. And they know that they're choosing the winning side. This happened in the Civil War in America as well. There were definitely people, and even some of the states here in the United States, that didn't technically go all in with the Union, with the North, until it was pretty obvious that the South was done for, that there was no way that the Confederacy was going to win. So we see this happen all the time. This is a common story in wars and conflicts, and it was common also in the French resistance. There's this irony here that when the Axis decided to invade, when the Germans are making their way up to France, there's this old cliche, or this old idea about France as the quote-unquote surrender monkeys, right? The French people basically roll over and just let Germany come in and do what they want, and so they end up under Nazi rule. And but the other side of that coin is then there is a significant French resistance. But actually, how significant was the French resistance? And what many scholars today, and I've actually had a discussion with this recently with a Holocaust studies professor, doctorate professor, about the fact that in France there was a certain amount of resistance during the war, during the Third Reich, and then after the war, there seemed to be a whole lot more people that wanted to claim their connection to the resistance. A lot more people that wanted to claim their connection to the resistance than everybody would have guessed during the resistance, that anybody would have been able to identify during the resistance. And so this has become part of the historical discussion in the contemporary era, being now is the year 2025. Historians are looking back on this, and they're seeing this kind of dynamic that played out where, there was significant French resistance, but there was a whole lot more people after the war who wanted to claim resistance connections, that they were French resistors, when there weren't that many people. There were nowhere close to that many people resisting during the war. And so, a lot of French people that really didn't resist seem to have wanted to pat themselves on the back and claim resistance when they really weren't a part of it. And France in general, wanted to kind of redeem its image in the world as, we went from the spineless abdicators and capitulators, and we want to redeem our image by kind of rewriting history, historical revisionism, if you will, to claim that there was this massive French resistance and everybody in France was involved somehow, and that's just not what actually happened. So now again, I don't want to take anything from the people who did resist or the significance of the French resistance. It is significant, it was significant, and they definitely deserve their recognition for that. It's just, one of these other elements of the discussion that's worth thinking and talking about. All right, so, in all then, what we get to is this idea that if we want to look back and we want to identify why people did not resist, or people still today, why they do not resist fascism, and then also look at why people did and do resist fascism, and then ask that question of and identify how resistance to fascism goes from a small group to a large group, from a minority activity to a majority activity. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a lot of encouragement that we can offer from examining the historical record. But my conclusion, and what I want to share with you here, and what I hope that you will see, is that there has to be somebody. There has to be someone kind of keeping the spark. Someone still maintaining the light. Someone still tending to the fire, as it were. And, if there's not a spark available, then there can be no flames. So, what accounts for resistance to fascism going from a small number of people to the majority? It's kind of it's difficult. It's difficult to identify that. It's fleeting. It's difficult to really understand that. Even for people who study this as a profession. But what I think we can do is identify the fact that when fascism goes from resistance to fascism goes from minority to a majority activity, there have been people there who have been resisting all along. There are the blessed few, if you will, that have been there kind of keeping the candle lit, waiting for the ethereal billows so that the flames of resistance can rise to meet the challenge of the darkness and oppression of fascism. Think of it as a budding seed in a field of desolation, a small white rose, if you will, reaching for the light among a forest that fascism has burned down. Without those first initial steps, without those first buds, those seeds budding into leaves, you can't ever rebuild a forest of life, of thriving, of freedom, of liberty, of justice. There has to be the seeds. There has to be the buds. There has to be those first ones who will keep the seeds, who will keep the light maintained until a majority will finally embrace it. And so my parting thought, my final thought for you in this series that we've been going through for the last several months as as I've kept this diary in my undergrad course, Resisting Fascism and Global History, the one thing that I would like for you to take away from it, and one of the most important elements I've taken away from this, is that the rest of the world be damned, some of us have to keep the light. Some of us have to be the first to resist. Some of us have to say, come hell or high water, come what may, whether the majority ever decides to join me or not, I will resist fascism. I take personal responsibility for my own liberty, for my own justice, and for the measure of liberty and justice that is experienced by my fellow humanity. I will embrace my humanity, and I will oppose fascism. I will resist, and I will be a keeper of the flame of resistance to fascism forever, no matter what. That's the end of our series, Resisting Fascism and Global History. I hope you've gotten something out of it. I apologize for this very long video to end it up, but I hope it's been at least somewhat worthwhile to you. I've enjoyed this project all along. Again, I'm not monetizing anything here, so if you didn't get anything out of it, that's okay. But I hope that you will continue to educate yourself and continue to engage this topic, and that you will see the value in continuing to educate yourself about resistance to fascism, in hopes that we may optimize each one our own abilities to be resistors if and when the time comes, whether that is today or tomorrow or someday in the future. I hope that we can all be as efficient resistors, as effective resistors to fascism as possible. And with that, fuck Trump and fuck ICE.